The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Matthew. Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up a mountain. He sat down, and his disciples came to him. He taught them, saying, "Happy are people who are hopeless, because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Happy are people who grieve, because they will be made glad. Happy are people who are humble, because they will inherit the earth. Happy are people who are hungry and thirsty for righteousness, because they will be fed until they are full. Happy are people who show mercy, because they will receive mercy. Happy are people who have pure hearts, because they will see God. Happy are people who make peace, because they will be called God's children. Happy are people whose lives are harassed because they are righteous, because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Happy are you when people insult you and harass you and speak all kinds of bad and false things about you, all because of me. Be full of joy and be glad, because you have a great reward in heaven. In the same way, people harass the prophets who came before you." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Christ. Just ignore that second part of the gospel. That's definitely not what that's like yeah. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable in your sight. Amen. Amen. I'm curious if you've ever had the experience of God using your car radio station to communicate with you. It happens to me with some frequency, I think. So on Thursday morning, the tropical storm Zeta was coming through, and I had dropped off my children to be cared for that morning, and I was listening to WNCW 88.7, which is one of my stress reduction methods right now. Just listen to good local folk music as much as possible rather than news. And as I was listening, I heard this beep, and it was the National Weather Service issuing a flood warning. So I listened as the car was being jerked along the road. And then I think because of the intensity of the wind, the signals got crossed somehow. And suddenly I was listening to the Christian radio station, 106.9 Light FM. And I heard this song saying, "God's not done with you yet." And I took that as a sign that my car would not be blown off the road and I would have another day to work on stateliness. But I got back to the office and I was preparing for today's celebration, and I was taking a moment to look at the pictures that some of you had sent in, folks that you love who have died either in the last year or who are close to your hearts. And I just felt this surge of tears well up. And it was a combination of stress, grief, and genuine gratitude for each person's face that I saw appear on that screen. That morning, Thursday morning, I was in a very liminal state, right? This thin veil between this world and the next, between what's temporal and eternal, between all the stuff that distracts me from my deepest purpose and your deepest purpose, which is love. All Saints' Day is one of those liminal feast days where we're invited to notice all the ways that God has given us people who fulfill in our lives and in the world's life Jesus' prayer that God's will might be done here on earth as it is in heaven. And so I want to lift up for your edification, consideration, and prayers 3 saints who I believe will help you, have helped me in my own understanding and my own experience of being a saint. Because you're saints. Did you know that? Okay, 8 o'clock awkwardly laughed when I said that. You guys are like, oh, we know. It's like, it's even hard for me to say that about myself, even though I believe it. I believe it's true of me, and I believe it's true of you. In the New Testament, the word for saints, hagios, means holy people, and it has nothing to do with being morally good. It has everything to do with being in relationship with God, who loves us and who calls us by name. We become saints by virtue of our baptisms. So I want to lift up a few more saints among those who are already here. First is Saint Ammonius. Has anybody heard of Saint Ammonius? Okay. Ammonius. He lived in the 4th century. He was in a community of hermits. I know that's an oxymoron, but they lived along the Nile River outside the big city of Egypt, and they were striving to be as close to God as they could through prayer and through study. And Saint Ammonius was known as being this sort of wonderful teacher, and people from the city would come and sit outside his tent and wait for him to offer them a word and some teaching. And this was the church was really fledgling. There weren't a lot of priests, and so priests could basically be conscripted. They didn't have to necessarily feel a call to the priesthood. So the laity loved Saint Ammonius, and they said, "We want you to be our priest." And so they tried to pull him out of his tent. And so he pulled out his knife. This is rated PG-13, and he cut off his ear. And then he cited Leviticus 31 that said that there cannot be dismembered priests. So the folks went back to the bishop and they said, "Man, we love this guy. He'd be an awesome priest, but he cut off his ear." And the bishop said, "No problem. I'll make an exception for him. If you can get him in front of me, I will make this man a priest." So they go back and they try to pull him out of his tent. And this time he gets out his knife and he threatens to cut off his tongue. And they know that he's serious, that he is so convicted of his call to be a faithful layperson, that he can fully live out his sainthood as a layperson, that he's not going to be ordained a priest. What I want you to hear from this story is 2 things. 1, a word of caution about equating any kind of hierarchy with holiness, right? Just because somebody's a deacon, a priest, a bishop, as great as Bishop Jose is, because somebody's been in this community for decades and you're new to it, none of that has anything to do with how saintly and how holy you are and the ways that God uses you to live out your vocation. And the second thing I want you to hear loud and clear from St. Ammonius' story, as you are preparing and praying and discerning what you're offering for the next year of Grace Church's ministry, which will consecrate next Sunday, your time, your talent, and treasure, I want you to hear that the church is absolutely dependent on laity who are spiritual leaders, laity who know well what it is to be faithful, and who can help lead the church time and time again out of the wilderness snares we find ourselves in and put us back on the path to the promised land. The second saint I want to mention, I think all of you have heard of, and that's Saint Teresa of Calcutta, also known as Mother Teresa. I feel like she's kind of the standard of sainthood that we know none of us are ever going to achieve. So even when we do some sort of beautiful work for God, sometimes we'll write it off by saying, "Well, I'm not a Mother Teresa." But Mother Teresa clearly was in cahoots with Christ and her incredible ministry to the sick and the dying on the streets of Calcutta. But it's less well known about her that she spent decades with spiritual dryness, absolutely no felt experience of God's love for her. She wrote, "Where is my faith? Even deep down, there's nothing but emptiness and dryness." What I want you saints to hear from the legacy of Saint Teresa of Calcutta is that saints don't always feel faithful. They don't always feel loved by God. They're not vibrating on some higher level closer to the divine. Rather, their sainthood is lived out in this day-to-day journey, one foot in front of the other, of learning how to love God by loving our neighbor. The third saint I want to lift up to you is a woman I never met. Her name was Marina Pasquarelli. I heard about her at our Wednesday noon Eucharist, our healing Eucharist out on the deck. You're all invited. We're talking about saints. And Maureen Hunt mentioned Marina. Marina had died about a week ago, and she was a member of Maureen's parish in Marietta, loyal Catholic, strong-willed Italian. She was a nurse. And at age 58, 2 years ago, she was diagnosed with ALS. And soon after she was diagnosed, like one of the first things she did was make arrangements to have her kidneys and her liver donated because she wanted to give the gift of life to others after her death. And her daughters at her funeral told stories about, she was a real active, bringing food to people, kind of busy, probably a busybody, I'm guessing, at the parish, just based on some of those stories. But she reassured her daughter. She said, even though my hands aren't working anymore, my body's not working anymore, my heart and my mind are, and I am now fully engaged in the ministry of prayer. So what I want you to hear from Marina's life is that God can continue to work in us and through us, and maybe especially in our greatest weakness and vulnerability. I think that's what it is to be a saint from our side of the equation. From God's side, it's that He's chosen us, He loves us, He calls us by name. But from our side, being a saint is coming more and more to trust that God can and will use us, whatever condition we're in, whatever shortcomings, but also whatever strengths and gifts, to be instruments of God's grace, to bit by bit and piece by piece, in our little corner of the vineyard, have God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And it's our role over and over again to offer ourselves, all that we are, to God's work. That's what we're going to be consecrating next Sunday. It's you. It's you. So I hope that none of you have to cut off an ear to ensure that your ministry and gifts as the laity are held up and indispensable and celebrated as holy. And I would be surprised if any of you are called to start a missionary movement in the streets of Calcutta. But I do know that many of you share in Mother Teresa's ministry of caring for the last, the lost, the least, and the lonely. And I pray that all of us here are spared the horrible disease of ALS. But I know that many of you saints give already generously of yourselves so that others might have a more abundant life. And I know that you allow the Spirit to pray in your weakness with sighs greater than words. You are the saints of God, cheered on by this great cloud of witnesses. And it's through you that God's will is being done. Thanks be to God.